Maybe Putin wants to drag Belarus into war against Ukraine and force Kiev to move its defenses. Zelensky also said this, talking about how Moscow would like to involve Belarus in the north of Ukraine. Moreover, lately, Russia and Belarus have intensified military exercises and cooperation. However, Belarusian involvement would be extremely risky for Lukashenko because while on paper Minsk could help Putin open a new front, in practice, if Belarus were to actually enter the war, it would stop being a useful platform for Russia and would become yet another target for Ukrainian drones. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos and I'm really happy about that, but you're not subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the channel. Thank you very much. Belarus is not a neutral country. In fact, in February 2022, Belarusian territory was used by Russia as a staging ground to attack Ukraine and move towards Kiev. However, up until now, Lukashenko has tried to limit his involvement. He has indeed given Putin infrastructure, bases, and military cooperation, but for now he hasn't sent the Belarusian army to fight, despite the fact that this possibility has always been discussed, and many believe it will become reality sooner or later if Putin orders it. And in fact, in recent days, the tension has started to rise again. Zelensky said that Russia is trying to drag Belarus even further into the conflict, and that Moscow is considering operations from Belarusian territory toward northern Ukraine. So potentially even in the direction of Kiev, or there is even talk of possible attacks against a NATO country. Now, of course, these are statements and not mathematical certainties. And Zelensky rightly has every interest in warning the allies and pushing to create new defenses and prepare to face the worst. But we can't just dismiss this risk as propaganda either, because Belarus really is a strategic point in the conflict and already has its own role. In fact, Belarus not only borders Ukraine to the south, but also borders Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia to the northwest, all NATO countries and in the European Union. This means that from Belarusian territory, Moscow can threaten both Ukraine and NATO's eastern flank at the same time. In geopolitics, even a threat is valuable, as it forces the other side to prepare and spend resources on recruiting men and securing borders. This might be where Putin sees an opportunity. In fact, if Russia were really able to reactivate the northern front, even just as a credible threat, Ukraine would have to keep more troops near Kyiv and along the entire Belarusian border than it already does now. And that's because it's not just the capital that's under threat. In fact, Belarus, in addition to Kyiv, could also target Lviv or the railway routes that bring Western aid from the west to the front. So Ukraine has to protect the entire northern border, and that means fewer men available at the front where they are really needed. And in a war of attrition, forcing the enemy to spread out is already a form of attack. And from this point of view, as you can see, a real attack wouldn't even be necessary. And this strategy works as long as Belarus hosts exercises, strengthens itself, and helps a lot. Indirectly, it helps Moscow. But if Lukashenko were to cross the line and actually enter the war directly on Putin's orders, then the calculation would change completely. And on one hand, it would force Ukraine to move many more troops to the northern front, but at that point, Ukraine could also strike targets in Belarus that are currently used by Moscow for logistical and strategic purposes. And Ukraine has already shown that it can strike Russian strategic infrastructure. There is already a long list of Ukrainian attacks against industries, refineries, and Russian logistics. And if Belarus were to actually enter the war, Minsk would risk being added to this list. At that point, refineries, military bases, airports, railways, and communication infrastructure could become much more vulnerable. And this would be a nightmare for Lukashenko. Because Belarus is not Russia and does not have Moscow's strategic depth or resources, it's a much smaller country and dependent on Russia. Moreover, Belarus is quite politically fragile, or rather Lukashenko is fragile. In fact, the dictator has ruled Belarus for over 30 years through an authoritarian system. And after the disputed 2020 elections, the regime was hit by European sanctions and strong international pressure. The European Union has sanctioned hundreds of individuals and entities linked to internal repression and support for Russia's war. And the measures have been extended until February 28, 2027, and the sanctions regime currently targets 310 individuals and 46 entities. It means that Minsk is already under pressure, and if it entered the war, that pressure would definitely increase. The European Union has already targeted the financial, commercial, energy, transport, technology, and Belarusian defense sectors, with measures that in many cases mirror those against Russia. So the point is that Lukashenko has already paid a price for his support of Putin, but entering directly into the conflict would mean paying a much higher price. And it's by no means certain that Lukashenko is willing to completely sacrifice himself for Putin. Of course, his regime is very dependent on Moscow, and without Russian support it would be very fragile. But the Belarusian dictator wants to survive, so it's no longer certain that Lukashenko can afford to do whatever Putin wants. And it's one thing to give Putin the territory, it's another thing to give Putin Belarus's own army. An army that, by the way, is much weaker than the Ukrainian one. Because the Belarusian army hasn't fought a war like Ukraine's, it lacks the combat experience Russians and Ukrainians have gained in recent years. And above all, it might not even have a strong motivation to go die in Ukraine for a war that many Belarusians might see as Russian and not Belarusian. And this is a huge political risk for Lukashenko. Because if he sends the army to Ukraine and the operation goes badly, he won't just risk military losses, but he will also risk breaking the implicit pact with part of his own system. I hold power, I suppress dissent, but I guarantee you security. And while for Putin a few thousand more Belarusian soldiers would be useful, for Lukashenko they are vital and also represent his security apparatus and his shield against instability. So if that shield is sent to the front, it gets worn out, and Putin knows all this too. That's why, in my opinion, many of Minsk's moves should be seen more as deterrence and propaganda rather than as a definite preparation for an invasion. Belarus, in fact, conducts exercises, shows military cooperation with Russia, talks about nuclear weapons, moves units, and fuels ambiguity. And all of this serves to tell Ukraine, look, something could also happen from the north. And it's absolutely right that the West doesn't underestimate this risk. But saying it could happen doesn't mean it will happen. And even if it might seem counterintuitive, the case of the nuclear exercises is emblematic. In fact, in May 2026, Belarus announced exercises with Russia to train to use Russian nuclear weapons stationed on its territory. And this is an interesting signal because nuclear weapons are mainly used to intimidate NATO and to tell the West that Belarus is under the Russian nuclear umbrella. But this also shows that for Putin, Belarus is useful as a platform for deterrence as well as for logistics and military purposes. A platform that would break if pushed too far, because direct entry into the war would not only mean risking Ukrainian attacks, but would also make any attempt to get closer to the West impossible. Something that could further damage the already compromised Belarusian economy. And in fact, in April 2026, Lukashenko said he was ready to meet Trump if a major deal between the United States and Belarus were on the table. Now, even here, we shouldn't be naive. Lukashenko can use dialogue with Washington to raise his asking price with Putin and gain bargaining power with Moscow because he can say, look, if you don't meet me halfway, I could open the doors to the Americans. The fact that there's talk of a deal with the United States shows Lukashenko may not want to stay in Putin's cage forever. He wants to stay aligned and dependent on Moscow, but not so much that he becomes expendable. And maybe he's even starting to test the waters for future international relations for the post-Putin era. It's not out of the question. Whereas if he were to enter the war directly, he would become even more dependent on Putin because new sanctions, new attacks, new isolation, and new internal instability would force him to ask Russia for even more protection and political support. And basically, Lukashenko would lose what little room for maneuver he has left. And let's not forget that an even more unstable Belarus could actually become a burden for Russia. Because if Minsk were hit and destabilized even further, Russia would have to spend resources to keep it afloat. And Moscow already has enough problems. It has to sustain the front in Ukraine, defend the refineries from drone attacks, protect energy infrastructure, manage economic sanctions, and so on. So adding a Belarus that is too destabilized might not be an advantage, and Moscow knows this, of course. And by this I mean that I think it's more likely for now that Belarus will stay out of the conflict and will just threaten from afar to force Ukraine to watch its back. That's because a Belarus not at war today is probably more convenient for Putin as well, not just for Lukashenko. However, we shouldn't underestimate the fact that if things keep going badly for Russia, as they are now, sooner or later Putin might decide to go all in and try to force Lukashenko to intervene in Ukraine. And at that point, all we could do is see what Lukashenko will do. But in any case, Zelensky is right to prepare for the worst. However, be careful, because actually they didn't just talk about attacks on Ukraine. Zelensky also mentioned that Russia might be considering an operation against a NATO country from Belarus. And looking at the long term, since I don't expect an attack tomorrow, it's worth considering this possibility. Because if Belarus were to attack Ukraine, it would be a very serious escalation, but it would still remain within the boundaries of the Russia-Ukraine war. If a joint Russian-Belarusian attack came from Belarus against Poland, Lithuania, or Latvia, possibly in the Suwalki corridor, it would be a different scenario since those countries are NATO members. And NATO is based on collective defense, meaning the idea that an attack against one member state is considered an attack against the entire alliance. Of course, this wouldn't automatically mean a world war in 5 minutes, but the level of risk would increase enormously. And it is precisely this Western cohesion that today makes a direct attack against NATO much less likely compared to an increase in pressure on Ukraine from Belarus. At that point, Putin would risk a direct clash with the world's strongest military alliance, not just wear down Kiev. Still, avoid making the opposite mistake. The scenario is unlikely today, but not impossible. It's only unlikely as long as NATO stays united and ready to defend itself. Because if the West were to become divided, let its guard down, or show weakness, then Russia's strategic calculations could change over time. And that's exactly why Europe and NATO must continue to strengthen the eastern flank, increase deterrence, and prepare for the worst. The fact is that the Kremlin has rejected Zelensky's words, saying they are an attempt to fuel escalation and prolong the conflict. And Belarus has also said that the nuclear exercises are not directed against other states. However, these statements should be taken for what they are. In fact, Russia and Belarus would never openly announce an aggressive plan. Anyway, the most realistic scenario is not Belarus invading Poland tomorrow, and actually, fortunately, not even Belarus invading Ukraine. The most realistic scenario, instead, is a Belarus that continues to be used as a logistical base and as a means to exert constant pressure on the West. Belarus is valuable to Putin even if it doesn't attack, perhaps even more so because it doesn't. As long as it stays out of the conflict, it can remain a protected base. It can host Russian systems, create uncertainty, and still force Ukraine to look north, and Lukashenko knows this. Just a second. Together with Valencia Falconi, we have created a support program for freelance professionals and senior employees who want to turn their experience into a structured consulting business. Valencia will help you build your offer, positioning, and client acquisition. I, on the other hand, will take care of communication and your online presence to help you become an authority in your field without necessarily having to be an influencer. So if you want to find out whether this program is right for you, you'll find the link in the description to book a free call with Valencia. The call is entirely obligation-free and is meant to help you understand if the program is right for you. Now let's get back to Belarus. Lukashenko knows that he is useful to Putin and that Putin needs Belarus, but he also knows that his usefulness depends on his regime staying in power. What if he faces a much stronger army in a very risky conflict? He would risk being useful as a diversion for a few days, maybe a few weeks, or even a few months, but also collapsing right after. That's why my interpretation is that the risk should indeed be taken seriously. Because Belarus is already part of Russia's conflict architecture, but a direct Belarusian attack against Ukraine remains unlikely, even if not impossible. Because if the advantages for Putin in a Belarusian intervention are clear, the risks for Lukashenko and therefore for Putin himself are even clearer. And do you think Lukashenko will really attack Ukraine? Write it in the comments, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my videos. Bye!